Thank you so much. First thing I need to do is watch my time, because I've been accused when you stand me up to talk about history, I'll keep you here until Friday. So I always do this, and in fact, having been raised fundamentalist where I used to go to church for about 20 years, they always said when that new preacher shows up and takes off his watch and sets it on the pulpit so he doesn't go over his time, you need to look out for him. He's probably a liberal. Okay, 45 minutes. Got it. And then allow some time for some questions. That'll be great. Let's see how badly the podium shakes. That's not too bad. Thank you all for coming out. I didn't know until last Thursday that our friends from C-SPAN would be here. And I was so terrified at the thought of being on TV in an empty bookstore that I emailed everybody that I knew. And now I'm here and I discover there's people here that I didn't email. So I probably feel a little less like Tom Sawyer at my own funeral. It's been a while since I've been on C-SPAN. I know this shirt used to fit, before and I brought a jacket so I would look dressy and everything, and then I was getting all ready and I popped a button off it. So even I didn't realize I was so proud to be here. Gosh, I'm really glad C-SPAN is here, because when the last time I did a C-SPAN taping, it was when the Sam Houston book came out. And like many writers with an addictive personality, I got in the habit of checking on Amazon.com 4 or 5 times a day about where my sales rank was. And so being a scholarly book from a university press, it was, bumping along at like 220,000, 230,000, 40, 50,000. And then every now and then it would just zoom up into the new book territory and then gradually, jag back down. And I'd get used to being sort of a scholarly nobody, and then it would zoom back up. And this happened once, and the next day I got an email from a friend of mine saying, I saw you on C-SPAN yesterday. And I realized, and I went back and I coordinated, and sure enough, whenever you're on C-SPAN, boy, that really helps your books. If only they had broadcast it more often. Literary biography was sort of a departure from me. I'm probably most known for doing Texas history and the West. In fact, the tie that I brought was a gift from the Daughters of the Republic, which is sort of fun whenever I go out and talk to the daughters. They're very big on being a Texas native, and first thing they say is, "Where are you from?" I live in Austin. No, where are you from? I grew up in Fort Worth. No, where were you born? Tulsa. Well, who do you think you are writing Texas history when you weren't even born here? And then, bless their hearts, they'll ask me about my family. And I'll have to tell them that my mother's family, she was adopted from a Cherokee family, so I've never known who my natural grandparents were. And my father's people were all either drunk or crazy, and I was never allowed to be around them. And as one sympathetic daughter said, well, no wonder you're so fascinated by history. You don't have any. But I've enjoyed this little departure outside of Texas history and trying to sort of enlarge my stage. Actually, I kind of cheated on this poor lady. The book has actually been out since May, but the first talk I gave, that was the introduction that I wrote, and the book hadn't come out yet. Doing some of the publicity has actually been fun. I got to do live radio in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, which was sort of an introduction to era that I wasn't quite ready for, because it was live, and as much as I love that lilting Irish accent, it's almost impossible to understand over the phone. And so I was waiting for them to click on live. And then when that happened, I heard a voice saying, "Welcome to News Talk Ireland, brought to you by Odor Eaters." So he started asking me about the book, and I was just going, really? Irish people have smelly feet? I had no idea. But beginning with Jack London, I want to begin maybe not where you thought I was going to begin, which is with Mark Twain, because Mark Twain was the leading best-selling author in the country up until the end of the 19th century. And what a lot of people never understood about Mark Twain was that of all the light humor and Americana sort of frontierish fun that he had, his editors, his daughters, when they took over the editing, hid from the public his deep agony and disappointment with the whole American scheme of things, the militarism, the laissez-faire capitalism, that he really hated that. But in his career, he couldn't afford for that to come out. So that was sort of brushed away from his public presence. Now, when Jack London came to prominence, boy, he felt the very same way, but the public had a vastly different kind of artist with Jack London. And so when Twain died in 1910, but he was no longer the top seller because Jack London had come along and pretty much dethroned him. So why write about Jack London? I mean, sort of the same problem that I had with Sam Houston. When there's already 50 books on the shelf, why would you write about Jack London? And it occurred to me that, well, there's all these books on the shelf, but they kind of break down into three different areas, one of which is that he's biographized through literary criticism. And you have all these books that sort of biographies, but at the very root of it, they get down to saying, you know, Jack London was so a great writer, damn it. And they made their case. And there's a very tight group of scholars that has sort of made this their life's work. And I guess that's sort of my first admission, is that I will never know more about Jack London than these scholars who have made their whole careers out of studying his life and works and what they mean and all that. So that's one kind of biography that was written about him. And another is the sort of fast and punchy biography that uses the dramas of his own life to sort of move the story of the biography. Now, I'll tell this story. When I began thinking about doing this book, two things. One, I had sort of what I thought was an advantage, which was that everybody, at least before this latest generation, had to read something of Jack London in middle school or in high school. You know, we all read The Call of the Wild, or we all read White Fang or The Sea Wolf or some one of these things. I slipped through a crack. I never did. So as I began thinking about Jack London, I thought, you know, what I really want to do is start reading him from his very first efforts so that I could not just become familiar with his works, but also watch him grow as an artist from when he first began to when he began to acquire some polish and some style and some panache. And the third kind, of course, is the juvenile biographies, and that's probably 30 to 40% of all the Jack London books that are out there are his efforts at writers' efforts of making him accessible to teenagers, because now he's sort of known as the juvenile author, I mean, for the kids to read Call of the Wild. Whereas in his own time, he was far better known as a social commentator, a journalist, a war correspondent, and his politics became so controversial that that sort of was pushed under the rug. Now, he is not the only American literary icon that we've had to sort of give a bath before we put them on the shelf of our timeless authors. You know, you can think of Charles Lindbergh from the right, or you can think of Helen Keller from the left, but a lot of times we just kind of forget about the great writer's flaws in order to keep them around. So I began the book wanting to do a 700-page sit down and shut up definitive, because there's never been one. There's been all these, you know, the literary criticism, the juvie biographies, the short and punchy, but there's never been a real doorstop that just gets into his head. And a very smart historian that I knew, I was talking about this with, and he said, well, I told him that I wasn't being allowed to do that. That, as my agent said, look, in this market, you're lucky to get a contract to write a literary biography, so behave yourself. You know, and the editor was calling up my agent saying, we're worried about him. He does big books. We don't want a big book. We want a little book. Don't you let him send us 200,000 words, because we won't do it. And so I behaved myself, and I gave myself a word limit for each section of the book, and they wanted 125,000 words. I cheated. I gave them 125,129. The big cheat was that I didn't count the footnotes, but that was my privilege. Anyway, I didn't get to write the big book, and as my very wise historian friend said, well, you know, there's really two ways that you can do good new history. One is that you can do all this new detail and go into greater minutiae than anybody else. Or you can rethink the topic, and you can just come at it from a new approach and not have to write 300,000 words.